Okay, so Frank, Judge Merchan warned Donald Trump during his arraignment to stop the violent threats, and yet, despite all of the things that Judge Merchan said, Trump persists. Why doesn't the judge just immediately slap Trump with a gag order? I mean, should Merchan stop Trump before there's actual violence? Because we know that there's going to be.
So this is a question, and I'm glad you led with it, because my guess is you led with it because we're going to be wrestling with this for the foreseeable future, and it raises all kinds of fascinating strategic and tactical questions, not only from the Trumps but from this judge. And so early on, it would be fraught with peril if he immediately slapped Trump with a gag order here. You've got a man running for office now. I think I've heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, in the past, that Trump is running for president really as a defensive mechanism. He needs to run for president.
Oh yeah,
to protect himself from things like this. And so everybody's going to be, just like the social media platforms let him back on in the last, say, 30, 60 days, right? YouTube and Twitter and everybody else. That's the same kind of concerns that a judge would have about a man running for president. And the judge has to ask himself, what value is it in gagging this guy? And let me make no bones about it. And no one knows this more than you. I'm not at all implying that Trump has the ability to restrain himself. He does not. And eventually this will get worse. But the question will be, so what? For the judge, I'm not going to stop him. This could potentially lead to jailing him, which again is going to, from my security side of how I think, Michael, it's going to get a gag and then a subsequent stint in jail for contempt of court for violating the gag order is only going to serve to heighten the security and threat concerns that I already have. There's another problem here, which is, while most judges understand they have the authority to gag a party to the matter in their courtroom, by the way, just so you know, for the legal nerds out there, the U.S. Supreme Court has never ruled directly on a judge's authority to gag a defendant. So they do, don't get me wrong, but we don't yet have that precedent set at the Supreme Court. But here's the next level of concern, and we've already seen the strategy play out. Trump's family members and associates, Don Jr., who immediately tweeted that photo of the judge's daughter, for example, the Roger Stones, the Steve Bannons, etc., are going to act as proxies for him to take some of the heat off of him in the eyes of the judge. And this creates an even greater challenge for a judge. That is, how do I gag a third party, not part of my courtroom? It can be done, but again, fraught with peril.
So I'm not a big fan of the whole concept of the gag order. And I can understand what Donald would end up doing should Judge Merchan decide to take that route, which, between you and me, I don't think that he will. We're really in a slippery slope right now because we've never had anyone like Donald Trump. He's a man baby who is angry because he's being held to accountability, and so he's going to lash out. The same way a child would lash out, so will Donald. So what ends up happening is he will go ahead and then they'll bring an action against the judge for the gag order, violating his First Amendment constitutional rights. And all that will do is help to slow the system down, at which point in time, maybe then, if in fact that he wins, and he might quite possibly could, he would now have a basis for a recusal. So we are now in this slippery slope, this fucking weird zone where it's okay for a defendant, think about this, this is crazy stuff, to threaten or to incite threats against the judge in your case, to incite threats against the district attorney and the prosecutors who will be handling this case. It's okay to incite or to attempt to incite threats against witnesses that he perceives will be testifying against him, and having his people do it all by what? By phone calls, emails, letters, crazy shit like that. There has to be a way. There has to be a way within which to put an end to this. And I think the only way is kind of like what they're doing for the DA right now, and most probably for the judge and many of the prosecutors. They've just provided the affected individuals with extra security. There's only one problem. What about witnesses? What about people who, like myself, who you know are going to be called as witnesses? I get the same social media threats, letters, crazy stuff like that from Trump supporters calling at all hours of the night. You know, I get it. Unfortunately, with technology today, and you know this better than most people, they have these programs now that you could do it through your computer, and you could basically, I can have the White House as the phone number that pops up, and it's virtually impossible to trace, which kind of sucks. So what do you have to do? You take the phone off the hook before you go to sleep, and that way they don't affect you and your house. But the extra security is a real issue because they don't offer that to witnesses. So it's great. They take care of themselves. I'm all for that. But they don't take care of the people that they brought into the matter. You know, one thing that people don't realize, and I tried to explain this to this one idiot who called. He was a big Trump supporter. Got me on my house phone, which I don't know how they got that number, considering it's a private number. But I tried to explain to him that I provided the testimony that I did before the grand jury via subpoena. I was subpoenaed to testify. So what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to now avoid the subpoena for the benefit of Donald? And I tried to explain to him, if you got subpoenaed, you too would have to come in and testify. The only difference is no one gives a fuck about you because you don't know what you're talking about. You're just some crackpot who should probably just take whatever money he's got in the bank and send it to Donald.
Well, as you know, as Mike Pence has learned about subpoenas and having to go as well, and a bunch of Secret Service agents on the detail at Mar-a-Lago, everybody's learning what the rule of law actually means. I think this is a very important discussion to lead off with, Michael, because I see a lot of good folks on social media saying, gag him. When is the gag order coming? He's going to get gagged. And I want to level set expectations. And I think you're helping to do that with this conversation, because as you just said, and let's not diminish what you just said. Let's be clear, and I'm with you on this. It's fraught with peril to do the gag orders. Definitely, if you were to gag before any threatening conduct occurred, there is law on that. Prior restraint, right? But the ultimate goal where this is headed is to secure everybody, to expect bad things are going to get said. Violence can be incited. We have a track record of that with this guy. And therefore, the judge, the prosecutors, the jury, and hopefully, as you pointed out, the witnesses, but not a lot of history on really, really fulsome security. By the way, for witnesses, we're talking about a very expensive proposition. This is going to cost the taxpayers of New York an incredible amount of money as this goes forward with security measures, both physical, intelligence-wise, overtime for officers. I mean, we'll be well into the millions or tens of millions of dollars on security before this is all over. But I want people to understand, like we're saying, don't think that the judge is going to sit there and gag Trump, because the first thing that Trump will do when gagged is violate the gag order. He wants this to happen, and it will incite more violence. And the term we use in the counterterrorism field is stochastic terrorism. It means terrorism that you yourself don't actually carry out or direct, but rather that you incite knowingly, deliberately, or with callous disregard for what's about to happen because of what you said. That's where we are. That was January 6th. January 6th could have been more direct terrorism. We'll find out. But that's where we are. So there's no easy fix here. And And security, like you said, is great, but it won't help for everybody. And like I said, security and law enforcement have to get it right every single day. And some lunatic lone offender only has to get lucky once.
That's right. The only difference here is, as I'm sure you saw, one of the things that dear old Donald did is he called for massive protests in New York, and violence and vengeance and all of those other words that, he was trying to stoke emotion into his supporters. Well, it didn't really work. I mean, the tens and tens of supporters that showed up, some of whom, you'll see them all the time in the background. Usually it's over his right and his left shoulder. There'll be a black male or a black female wearing blacks for Trump. They're hired. These are not real. It's an organization that's paid, in order to show that there's diversity for Donald and so on. These aren't. So I think there were like 10 of them at the date where he was arraigned. I'll tell you who was out in force. The people that want to see accountability, the people that believe that Donald Trump is a clear and present danger to American democracy. And I have to say this as well, and this is not to take anything away from the Capitol Police, who are incredibly brave, unprepared at the time. Why? Well, maybe because Donald had his hand in that as well as the Washington Police, also incredibly brave. But there's nothing like NYPD. I mean, NYPD is like a militia. It's bigger than many countries' armies, and they're better trained. These guys don't, when I say, these officers, they don't fuck around at all. They've been doing this for a long time. They know exactly how to deal with crowds. They know how to deal with things like when the Pope comes into town or dignitaries or presidents and so on. They have this thing down to a science. And there was no way in the world that anything resembling January 6th was going to happen on their watch. So, my hat's off to, if I was wearing a hat, I would say hats off to the NYPD. Well done. Nothing happened. It was peaceful. There was still protests. Like I said, the tens and tens of people in different little swarms of area and so on. It didn't really matter. But for the most part, even in front of Trump Tower, in front of Trump's, apartment, the biggest group of individuals that showed up there for that was the media. And they had them penned off in their own specific area. I went by it. I saw it. I mean, that was like 4, 5, 6 rows deep. Whereas you had your stragglers here and there holding up these stupid Trump signs, or you had those that were opposing him, convict him, blah, 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 lock him up. Also, completely unnecessary. Let the system run itself. Let the judge make the decisions. I still think what Don Jr., what Eric did, what all of these, inner circle acolyte fools, really stupids, are doing, I think it's not going to inure to Donald's benefit. But what I did like is after getting handed his ego, and as I've said on this show, probably to you in the past, Donald has a very fragile ego. And so having to be beneath the judge and having to plead not guilty to the 34 counts where he knows that he's got real problems on his hands, he goes running back to Mar-a-Lago. He's got that whole room filled, and it's about, 250 people in there total, many of whom are employees that they just shove in there, right? And so what ends up happening, he's having dinner in order to reinflate his deflated ego with the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and a couple of other sycophants that as soon as he walks into a room, they all stand up. Did you see that procession in? If that wasn't the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, sitting there waving, what the fuck are you waving for? Daddy just got indicted. You got Don there. He's probably half baked himself. Eric walks in, Kimberly Gargoyle, and then Marjorie Taylor Greene thinking that, she's coming from a parade. They all look so fucking stupid.
Let me tell you something. Marjorie Taylor Greene's the quick fleeing of Manhattan was a sight to behold. She got turned around and she was livid with the as you say, the counter protesters who turned out banging pots and pans, blowing whistles. And she literally was drowned out, smart enough to catch on that not a word she said was going to be heard by anyone, and got out and then completely castigated, New York City. This is worth watching, Michael, from my national security lens. Why? Because we may be looking at Trump's future. Can he command a crowd? Can his cohort put out a protest party that they want? Or will no one come to that party? This is very early. We cannot declare victory on the security side at all, by any stretch. But this is bad optics for him, the inability to turn out a crowd. And then you saw the filing during his arraignment. His team filed to have him not have to appear for the next hearing. Why? For those who say, well, he loves a circus. What was that about? He does not like the optics of not controlling a room, and him walking into a courtroom and being sheepish and under a judge's, admonishment is not happy time for him. So, and the judge, of course, responded, no, I like my defendants in my courtroom. So this will repeat itself. And unfortunately, the security's got to be right every time it does.
I like when he was walking through the door and the police officer didn't hold the door and the door sort of slammed on him. It's been a while since Donald actually held his own door, King Donald, right? Exactly. I want to go to something a little bit more serious, believe it or not, than even that, something that I care more about. 3 kids and 3 adults were gunned down in Tennessee, right? Nashville. But nevertheless in Nashville, GOP lawmakers voted 3-2 to expel 2 elected officials for joining peaceful, and I'm going to say it again, for joining peaceful protesters against gun violence. Now, take like Ron DeSantis has tried to make protesting illegal in Florida. I mean, this is some real authoritarian shit going on here, right? First of all, and it's unconstitutional. How do we legally stop state governments from becoming fascists?
You are right to say that this issue is more serious than what we just discussed, because it goes toward the heart of being able to freely and fairly elect our representatives to speak for us in state legislatures. And if they're going to get expelled for representing the will of the people of Tennessee, the data and surveys are out on post that horrible shooting in Nashville. And the people of Tennessee have spoken, and they say they want more law enforcement and they want more gun enforcement, and they want to consider a minimum age for purchase of a weapon. This is who votes for these legislators, and yet they've been totally disregarded, and they've seen 3 of the people they voted for come under expulsion hearings, and 2 of them gone. And 2 of them, let's say, call it what it is. 2 of them happen to be Black that were expelled, and
right.
the white woman gets to stay. That is at best horrible optics, at worst racism. It's been reported by one of those Black legislators that a Republican who helped author the expulsion motion called him, quote, an uppity Negro, end quote. This is 2023, and this is where we are. So if the shooting of school children in your community doesn't do it for you, I don't know what does. I've listened closely to all of the explanations. I listened when Republican leaders in the state of Tennessee tried last night on cable TV to explain what happened. None of them could explain what they were doing. None of them. Except they didn't follow any established procedures. They didn't refer the conduct to the ethics committee. They couldn't address how someone who reportedly urinated on another legislator's chair was left in the Senate undisciplined. I don't get it, except you're right. We are facing, this isn't just about Tennessee. This is about Florida. It's about Texas. It's about other states where elected officials are going to be kicked out and silenced if they don't get with the authoritarian program. And I'm sorry to say, this looks like the near future for us.
I mean, this is scary shit. I really want people to stop for a quick second, whatever they're doing, and think about this. Think about just how dangerous this GOP is right now, especially a GOP that's following the guidelines of Donald J. Trump. I mean, this is very scary stuff. When you're protesting peacefully, this is not a violent mob. This is a peaceful protest against gunning down innocent people and creating some form of sensical gun legislation that they could now remove you because that house is controlled by a member of an opposite party. Never in American history would something like this ever take place. Nobody in their right mind would ever think, "Oh my gosh, I'm the head of the House in the state of New York, and I'm a Democrat, and a Republican who happens to be elected official is peacefully protesting whatever the heck it is that they're protesting. Let's say gun violence or whatever it might be. And because they're a member of the opposite party, I actually have the ability to remove them from their seat, to remove them from a position that they attained as a direct result of a free and fair election." This is scary stuff. So either you keep your mouth shut and you go along despite the fact of something as atrocious as innocent lives lost as a result of gun violence.
It's not happening in a vacuum either. You've got to, if you're going to talk about this issue of silencing elected officials in states, you also have to talk about the gerrymandering that's going on like never before, carving out voting districts so that it's almost impossible for minorities to win and for minority candidates to win, and then depriving opportunities to vote. So Harris County, Texas, a huge county where Houston sits, right? They went down to one drop box for Harris County, right? We're talking millions of voters. And yeah, you want to vote? There's one box, find it in the county. That's what's happening. Make it harder to vote, make it harder to speak out, make it harder to enact change in favor of democracy. And I'm telling you, the 2024 elections are going to be really, really challenging for all of us.
You know, look, a lot of that, when it comes to gerrymandering, believe it or not, has to do with technology. Somebody figured out an algorithm, how to look at specific areas, and if you move the voting line, if you gerrymander the district over, let's say, 4 blocks, you could actually flip the vote based upon data that exists in the internet, right? Or in whatever space that, that information sits in. By moving it over 4 blocks and changing another area, which is why you start seeing the territory, the gerrymandered districts, now looking like Italy, right? It goes up and down, or it goes left and right, thin, then it gets to a fat area. What they've done is they've just figured out how to move from what block to what block in order just to change the outcome of an election. This is not normal stuff.
No, certainly gerrymandering has been going on for generations, but what we're seeing now in some of these states is at the height of ludicrousness. So yes, you're carving out a white suburban enclave and sticking it into a voting precinct with an urban demographic, and now it's impossible, right? Now the whites outnumber the blacks in that district, and you can't even put up a minority candidate for that matter. Yeah, and then you talk about authoritarianism. So let's go back to Nashville, and let's also include DeSantis in Florida in this discussion on what's happening. So let's say, for example, the outrage that happened in Nashville yesterday. Let's say some of the big Tennessee corporations, FedEx, that's headquartered in Memphis, the Tennessee Titans of the NFL, Vanderbilt University. Let's say they come together and go, we're outraged. We want to make a stance for democracy. Well, let's go over to Florida and watch what happened when Disney spoke out against DeSantis and the so-called Don't Say Gay bill. What did he do? He literally took their municipality authority away from them. He said, now I run Disney. Right now that's being challenged. But if you're FedEx or you're the NFL, or you're sitting there going, we would like to speak out, but are we going to get shut down by the Tennessee legislature like they did in Florida? This is what's going on.
Yeah. And it's scary. The whole thing is just scary. And it's why I keep trying to tell everybody the single most important thing that you could do is to vote. Anybody who is too tired, it's too difficult, I don't want to stand on any lines, and so on, the apathy to voting will ultimately be the end of our democracy. So each and every one of us have that obligation, and people need to vote. Plain and simple.
We're seeing unprecedentedly close voting outcomes. Look at Lauren Boebert's district in Colorado. We're seeing just razor thin margins. So for people who think my vote doesn't make a difference, it absolutely makes a difference.
Yep. So Frank, let me ask you this, because you and I both agree that the Supreme Court is broken. I can't even believe that I'm having this conversation. I remember as a kid and learning about the Supreme Court, and this is a job that you have for life. The only way that you end up leaving is either you want to or in a box. It's one or the other. And they were the smartest of the smarts. They were, impressive. But this week, it's revealed that Clarence and Jeannie Thomas, right? We already know about Jeannie Thomas with the January 6th insurrection, and we know about Clarence Thomas deciding that he didn't want to start prosecuting anybody in order to potentially protect his wife. Clarence Thomas, on behalf of himself and his wife, accepted a whole slew of free luxury trips, literally now for 20 years, from this major GOP super donor, this billionaire Harlan Crow. Now, this couple has gone out of their way to prove, literally, my opinion, to prove that they're corrupt. I think that they're going out of their way to show that they are legitimately above the law. And now they're doing it in everyone's face. To your knowledge, are they even being investigated? Is there an investigation pending into this?
So, look, you're right. I have held off. You know that I'm an institutionalist. I will not castigate our institutions, and I've held off on saying anything about the brokenness of the Supreme Court until yesterday, when I tweeted that, yes, I believe now the Supreme Court is broken. And that has little to nothing to do with whether I like or dislike their rulings. It rather has to do that they simply refuse to come under the authority of an ethics code for themselves. And I place that blame squarely on Chief Justice John Roberts, who had plenty of lead time here on numerous issues, many of them involving Clarence Thomas and his wife. And he could have said, hey, we're going to sit down and draft an ethics code because every other federal judge has to comply and we don't have one. And he's not done it. And yet he goes out on the speaking circuit, Federalist Society, et cetera, and says he's at a loss to understand why Americans have lost faith in the Supreme Court. It's exactly because of this It's because they lack an ethics code to follow. And let's be clear here. This major Republican donor for the last 20 years has at least annually taken the Thomases on trips, one of which is calculated with great work by the journalists at ProPublica, by the way, who did this expose. It's hard work. They had to track tail numbers, credit card. It was hard work. And they said one trip, if you calculate the chartering of the private jet, the private yacht, the villa rentals, food, lodging, well, one trip would have cost $500,000 that they looked at. So that's happening for 20 years, every goddamn year. And it came out yesterday that this donor, who, by the way, is of the Trammell Crow property real estate fortune, this guy built a statue for the middle school that Clarence Thomas attended. The statue is of his favorite teacher, a nun that taught Clarence Thomas in 8th grade. That's a statue donated by this guy, Crow, to the middle school that Clarence Thomas attended. This goes on, stuff like this goes on all the time. We have no idea whether other justices are doing anything like this, because why? There's no transparency and little to no reporting.
Look, the counter argument to this is something that Clarence Thomas put out in a statement when he said, Harlan and Kathy Crow are among our dearest friends, and we've been friends for over 25 years. As friends do, we have joined them on a number of family trips during the more than quarter century that we have known them. Early in my tenure at the court, I sought guidance from my colleagues and others in the judiciary, and I was advised that this sort of personal hospitality from close personal friends who did not have business before the court was not reportable. I have endeavored to follow that counsel throughout my tenure and have always sought to comply with disclosure guidelines. Well, I get it. Everybody has a friend who is financially very well off. In this case, maybe not as well off as Harlan Crow, but, they'll turn around and they'll say, hey, I'm taking the plane and we're going to wherever it may be going. Why don't you guys join us for the weekend?
Yeah.
Okay. How many of us have friends like that?
This is a government. I want to point something out, though. This is a
by the way, I hope that my sarcasm was noticed on you, Frank, because I was waiting for you to say, well, I don't have a friend who's got the private plane and the private islands and the houses in Indonesia all the way to California and around the world. I have friends who have a boat. And they'll say, hey, let's take the boat out. Some of them range to quite nice sized boats. Others are, smaller little fishing boats that we go out on and horse around. And I don't, I didn't chip in for the gas, but I think we're talking about a whole nother story here, especially considering I'm not a Supreme Court judge.
Right, exactly. This is the issue, right? Because you could have friends, and boy, we all want a friend with a boat. That's the old joke, right? Hey, what's better than owning a boat? Having a friend with a boat, of course.
Exactly.
But this is a government official. He sits on the highest court in the land. And I can tell you what the ethics training I had in the FBI, and we had strict reporting guidelines, but particularly when you get into the senior executive ranks. But very simple rule they asked us to follow was, hey, ask yourself when you get one of these offers, and boy, when you're running a field office in a territory, or you're an assistant director, you suddenly have all these people making you really interesting offers. And the rule of thumb was to ask yourself, would I be getting this offer if I was not an FBI official? And always the answer was no. So yeah, some guy, richest guy in town, offering you free use of his jet. Hey, you're the new guy in town in charge of the FBI. How about a mortgage discount? Because I run the largest mortgage bank in town. You get all of this, and you have to say no, and you have to report even the approach. So the fact that the Supreme Court justice is ruling on cases involving the Republican Party, gerrymandering cases, and literally, as ProPublica reported, the next day going on vacation with one of the largest Republican donors, how can that not impact your thinking? And not to mention your wife, Ginny Thomas, getting $120,000 job from this guy. How about that? That's a gift. Let's face it.
Yeah. Look, and again, I just find the whole thing to be so dirty. That this is the problem. When you have a job for life and you cannot be removed, this becomes a real problem. I've always been opposed to lifetime positions, to the lifetime tenure, whether it's a federal court judge, whether it's a Supreme Court judge. Nobody has a lifetime job.
Right.
Other than these folks. I've never heard of such a thing. You don't even have Harlan Crow doesn't even have a lifetime job in his own company. Maybe one of his kids turns around, the kids get all together. If you watch Succession, right? You see what happens when kids start getting some of the shares here and they decide they know more than daddy. But I want to move on and ask you this, because we're going to stay on Supreme Court for a second. What the hell is wrong with Justice Roberts? I mean, on his watch, Chief Justice Roberts, the court has earned the absolute worst approval ratings ever. I mean, it goes back to what I was just saying to you. Don't you think that maybe it's time for term limits? Or maybe, for example, members of the Supreme Court should be elected like the president so that they would have to answer to the people, because they don't answer to anyone. They just do whatever the hell that they want, and depending upon how the vote goes. And that's how you now see an overturning of Roe v. Wade. In fact, if we use that as the example, the last, well, I should say, there was four, taking Ketanji, Jackson out of the equation. The three that were nominated and put onto the Supreme Court by Donald J. Trump, they all acknowledged that they would respect what's called stare decisis, the previous decision, including, for example, Roe v. Wade. 50 years it's been law. Well, did they? No. The first thing they do that a case comes in front, they end up overturning it. This is not right. They lied to the American people. They lied to Congress in order to get the approval. And they still do exactly what it is that they want. Well, they all finally get some sort of a change of heart, that, the way that they stated they would accept stare decisis, then to literally within months overturn the entire decision.
Yeah, so to say that I'm sorely disappointed in John Roberts would be an understatement. I saw glimmers of hope early in his tenure on the court. But really, he showed me who he was. You mentioned the Roe v. Wade overturning of the Dodd decision. He showed me who he was with regard to what he decided to do with the leak investigation of that draft opinion, right? You remember that. And what he did was he went totally internal to the court. He picked the woman who is the marshal of the court. Please don't confuse that job with the U.S. Marshals. That's not at all what she is. She is the woman who walks in every morning into the court and says, "Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. The court is now in session." And she has the so-called security force for the Supreme Court building and the justices. That's who he picked to run the leak investigation of that draft opinion on Dodd. What did she do with that job? She didn't really interview the justices. She had discussion with them and a dialogue with them. She went to a security firm run by, was it Mukasey or someone in New York to bless the investigation, and then declared that there was no way to find out who did this. Never interviewed, even though employees told her, "Yeah, I told my spouse. We were overturning Roe v. Wade." Never went outside the court to interview any of those spouses. Never did really full forensics that you can do when you have law enforcement authority, like the FBI. You can subpoena the platforms, right? See who talked to who got on the phone with who, which wife or spouse gave up this case to a media reporter with this phone number. She did none of it. That was John Roberts' decision to sweep this leak under the carpet.
Embarrassing. Now, Frank, I know that that you're a safe gun advocate, but with each mass murder Their protests and the public outcries, and you start seeing, prayers and sympathy for the families. You have all the heart emojis going out, the broken heart emojis and so on. And then nothing happens. Now, President Biden is calling for the assault weapons ban to go back into effect. How likely do you think that Congress will take any meaningful action? How likely do you think it is that Congress will take any action at all? And what do you think that we can do right now to curb these senseless shootings and the unfortunate loss of life that's associated?
So that's easy. You can just press my speaker button on my on my chest, and I'll tell you exactly what needs to be done. The second I say that, somebody in the audience will say, well, that wouldn't have applied to Nashville, or that wouldn't have helped in El Paso, or that would have helped. Yeah. So, let's not keep finding the exceptions. Let's find the middle ground that we can work on. Really good work being done by Senator Chris Murphy out of Connecticut, by the way, on helping people find that middle ground. And yes, it's frustratingly small baby steps that are being taken, but they are steps that are being taken. Right now, today, with pending legislation, what could be done and will not be done because of the split Congress is the closing of the gun show loophole. You've heard this before. The notion that, yes, by God, we require background investigations nationally through the FBI and every time you purchase a weapon, except when you go to the county fairgrounds on the weekend and buy a gun at the big gun show. Then we don't care. Except when your neighbor down the street says, hey, I'd like to sell you my shotgun. No, we don't require that then. Number one, close the gun show loophole. Number two, the Charleston loophole. You remember a kid by the name of Dylan Root shoots up a Bible study Wednesday night at a AME church in Charleston, South Carolina. Come and find out, when he purchased his gun, there was a glitch and a discrepancy in the background check. And you know what the law says? If it takes more than 3 days for the background check to get figured out, we default to giving you the gun. That is absolute nonsense. And the data shows that thousands of people have been handed their guns who would have failed the background check. So it works if we just do it. Those two things can be done right now, and the bills are waiting to pass, and there's nothing we're going to do about that. Also, yes, I'd love to see a minimum age of 21 for an assault-style weapon. I'd love to see that. If that couldn't happen after Uvalde school shooting, it's not going to happen. But that's where I am on that. I've got plenty more, but those two would start right away.
And go right back to that whole thing about voting. Right? You got to vote for people who want sensible gun laws. Look, I was, prior to, of course, me paying the porn star to pull the president's mushroom pecker, right? I had a full carry here in New York. I am not anti-Second Amendment at all. I just don't understand. And I'm not saying it because people always say, fuck you, Cohen. You're just saying this because you hate Donald and, you hate the Second Amendment. No, I don't. No, I don't. Not for either, right? It's just not true. I myself trained in firearms. I myself owned multiple firearms prior to, again, losing my license as a felon, and hopefully I'll figure out how to get that back. I just don't understand the necessity of owning one of these assault rifles, one of these weapons of war. I'm not sure why you need an AR-15 versus a 30-06. I don't understand the reason why. Because it's not rapid fire, because you can't dispense of 100 bullets in under 60 seconds. I mean, we were smart enough to get rid of these bump stocks, right, that make any gun into a fully automatic. I don't understand what the big argument, what the big fight is over this, and I'll never understand it. But I want to jump into a different topic for a second now. The word on the street is that Jack Smith is closing in on a Trump indictment in the Mar-a-Lago documents case, right? And for those people that don't know, the Mar-a-Lago document case, of course, are the stolen documents that were all labeled top secret.
And most importantly, the investigation of those documents was obstructed by Donald Trump.
I was going to get to that. Sure. It's not so much the fact that he was in possession of them. It's as much as that he refused to return them and then had his lawyers lie, right? Like Christina Hobb, who's now probably going to be testifying against him as well, because they lied. He lied. He lied to her, and he had other people lie to her, and et cetera, et cetera. But what signs are you seeing, if any? And do you think that because of so much evidence and the paper trail, that the case will be relatively easy to prosecute?
Yeah, so what I'm looking at is what some of the stuff you just mentioned. The dam has broken with regard to the challenges that people around Trump have tried to launch to prevent them from having to testify. The dam is broken. Secret Service agents assigned to his detail at Mar-a-Lago are going to be testifying. What are they possibly going to say? They're the folks. Remember, Trump threw them under the bus in a footnote on one of his filings in this.
Wow, what a shocker.
Yeah, he said, right. There was a little red footnote that said something like, oh, and the Secret Service, by the way, they set up a skiff at Mar-a-Lago and they guard the documents for me. Well, let me tell you something. My phone started ringing off the hook with sources saying that is bullshit. And so
yeah,
they don't set up skiffs for secure compartment information facilities for former presidents. They never had one. They'll have a temporary one for a real president. No, and they don't know. So what are they going to testify? No, we never guarded. But even worse, yes, we saw people coming and going. And yes, we think we saw these people in that room where the documents were coming. That's what they're going to say. It's going to be damning for Trump. And then, of course, famously, Vice President Pence, we now have a ruling saying with regard to January 6th that he's got to testify. But the Corcorans, the Bobs, with regard to the documents case, the obstruction, the valet, Knott, or whatever his name is, who gets him 12 Diet Cokes a day and, moved documents that's on videotape, tried first to lie about it. Then he was confronted with the security videotape, moving the boxes. It's closing in, and they're very close. The only question I have is, will Smith treat his two grand juries and his two cases, January 6th, and Mar-a-Lago documents, will he treat them separately, or will he wait until he's got them all and go forward with that? I don't know the answer to that, but my money, by the way, Frank,
is he treats them separately.
Yeah.
They're two separate and distinct cases, and I think he will compartmentalize them because they don't overlap.
There's
right?
no
I
need.
mean, they're just
There's absolutely no need.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, there's no need to combine them, and it's separate prosecutors and separate agents. And yeah, I agree with you, and separate grand juries. So that will be first. But then the big question mark is Fulton County, Georgia, which, again, another state case, very powerful case involving, if the grand juror, that special grand juror foreman who spoke until she stopped speaking, thank God, if she's correct, we're looking at a dozen or more potential indictments of powerful people. And I love the state system because that cannot be pardoned by Trump or whoever becomes the next president.
I've actually said this 100 times, but I still always say it, and I think it's always worth repeating, that nobody should want to see anyone, and that includes Donald J. Trump, indicted, prosecuted, convicted, incarcerated, simply because you don't like him, simply because you don't agree with whether it's anything that comes out of his mouth, or most of the things that come out of his mouth, or some of the things that come out of his mouth. He should only be indicted, prosecuted, convicted, and incarcerated because he broke the law, right? And I think people have to, they have to start to tone it down, even as it relates, believe it or not, to Donald. Rest assured, what he has done is so in your face. It couldn't be more in your face if he actually wrote it on his knuckles in indelible ink and punched you in the forehead, to put it on you. Everybody should see exactly what he did. There's not an argument as far as, I believe, the district attorney here in New York's case. There's no argument. The documents speak for themselves. And then you have the same thing with Jack Smith's Mar-a-Lardo documents case. What could you argue? First and foremost, were you or were you not in possession of the documents? I mean, I don't think that this trial should be a week's long. I think to me, it's like a day. It should be a day-long trial. You only need to ask Donald 10 questions. First and foremost, were you in possession? Did you know that you should not be in possession? Before you answer that, Donald, please take a look at the following document, right? Whereby your lawyer attested on your behalf that you returned documents. You claim that you did. Then you were asked again. Remember, something a lot of people don't know. It's not like they asked him once for the return of the documents. It was over a year that they were asking him for the return of these documents until they finally went and sought judicial intervention, got the subpoena, got the warrant, and went ahead and retrieved the documents that don't belong to him. By the way, Donald, are you aware that you are not permitted to have these documents? And if you say the answer is no, that you're not aware, well, then that would comport with the stupid shit that keeps coming out of that hole underneath your nose, whereby you say, I'm allowed to. And then that's the Sean Hannity interview. No, that's not the way the Presidential Records Act reads. You're reading it the way you want. They're not your documents. They belong to the American people.
Yeah, this is why I think I agree with you. It's relatively cut and dry, although it will be protracted, of course, and there'll be all kinds of experts that will have to be brought in by the prosecution with regard to declassification and a president's authority and what that process should look like, right, or not look like, because that's going to be a major defense of his. But what he cannot defend against is the obstruction. He just can't. And you're right. Multiple visits. The head of DOJ's national security section personally went down there and said, pretty please, National Archives for months, and then the subpoena, and then the search warrant and videotape of people moving boxes. He can't defend against the obstruction. There's just to be clear, there has to be process attached to declassification. I don't care if you're the president. There has to be process. And I think what they're going to find, don't be surprised if part of the obstruction case is this guy, Kash Patel, making stuff up about the alleged, blanket declass process that never happened. It is smoke and mirrors. And I think he is jammed up, Patel, on that, and it's going to be shown to be a liar with regard to that.
Right. You're not permitted to declassify just by thinking about it. Look, Frank, as the FBI extraordinaire, agent that you are, I do have to ask you this, right? Jim Jordan and this weaponization subcommittee, they really seem to have an axe to grind with the FBI. Jim Jordan spent months on this bogus whistleblower witch hunt. Can you do me a favor? Explain to my listeners, why do you think that Jim Jordan has it in for the FBI? And what do you think it is that he's ultimately trying to accomplish?
Well, it's tough to get inside his head, but the general theme for the entire Trump cohort is to attack the investigators, whether you're Bill Barr, John Durham, no matter who you are, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for defunding the FBI. If you're attacking them and the president, you're investigating them, you are abusing your authority, according to them, and you must be defunded. So with regard to the so-called whistleblowers, for months, Jim Jordan claimed that upwards of 12 to 14 former FBI employees had come to him and claimed that they were fired or suspended or had waste, fraud, and abuse to report. I want to make it clear here, not one of those individuals has been granted whistleblower status by the Department of Justice. They are fired employees who refused to do their job. One of them refused to take the COVID vaccine. Another one that's very outspoken refused, and by the way, I've never seen this in my 25 years in the FBI. He was a SWAT team member in Florida. He walked away from a SWAT assignment. You never leave your SWAT buddies, ever.
Wow.
He walked away from SWAT because they were going to arrest a January 6th defendant. And he refused to do it. That's who we're dealing with, not real whistleblowers. make-believe whistleblowers. And when Jim Jordan put on his first 2 or 3 top so-called whistleblowers, they fell flat on their face and were destroyed as people just making stuff up who were disgruntled, suspended, or fired. That's that, but it's going to go on. The defund the FBI thing is going on and on and on. And look, people, I always tell, you've heard the thin blue line, right? What separates us from total chaos in society? If you only knew what a week without the FBI would do to our national security.
Frank, let me ask you this then, because that you're so right. People don't know exactly what the FBI does and how important they are to the sustaining of our democracy. So then what kind of an effect do you think that this is having on members of the FBI and the intelligence communities when you have these MAGA moron lawmakers, right, and members of the public constantly trying to discredit them, their work, and the reputation of the agency?
I'm not going to pretend anymore. My answer is different than it was, say, a year or 2 ago, Michael, to this question. I'm not going to pretend that this hasn't had an impact on the rank and file, because it clearly has. We saw Washington Post reporting a few weeks ago, Carol Leonnig and others, on the story that broke that there were loud, vehement disagreements between the Washington field office management and DOJ about whether a search of Mar-a-Lago was needed. You saw that reporting, shouting at each other. Allegedly, the guy in charge of the Washington field offices, one of the most important field office jobs in the FBI, right? Said something like, I'm going to have to be ordered to lead that search because I'm not doing it. So when you ask me, what's the impact of this constant denigration of the Bureau? It is to cause them all to question themselves, to cause some of them to take sides, some of them to think politically, when generally FBI agents never think politically because they're generally apolitical animals. So yes, it's having an impact. And yes, there's reports of screaming debates on January 6 cases and others. And it's the saddest thing that can happen, because the FBI must continue to be perceived as apolitical and neutral, and it has not been perceived that way since Trump took office.
Well, that's the problem with the whole DOJ. Trump and Bill Barr and others, they've really fucked the DOJ up. And look, I have a lawsuit against the U.S., which has its own problems because of the Dodd decision with overturning now Bivens, which gives you the ability to hold the government accountable for violation of your constitutional rights, which they did. I mean, there's no argument there. I have a federal judge that acknowledged that they did, but that's a whole nother story. Look, Frank, the hour goes by quick. I have one last question for you. And this is one that I really gave a lot of thought to. How would I end the show with the great Frank Figliuzzi? And this is something that I don't have an answer to, so I'm really looking forward to your answer. What the hell is the latest on this Hunter Biden laptop shit? Because all you hear from this far right and these MAGA morons is anytime that there's anything that Donald Trump is being accused of, all you hear them say is, well, what about Hunter Biden's laptop? I mean, do they or do they not have anything tangible against this guy? Because we hear that the laptop has been potentially tampered with now by the Russians, by Rudy, and God knows who else. I mean, we have no idea anything about this laptop. Because I really believe that if there was something there, that we would know it by now. But there's nothing there other than some nude photos of Hunter with a prostitute doing drugs. And we all know that he has or had a massive drug problem. And I feel sorry for him for that.
Yeah. For those who keep repeating that mantra, where's Hunter? Where's the lot? What about the laptop? I hope to God that never in their lives do those people ever have to deal with a family member who is seriously addicted to drugs, because it is, of course, a nightmare for that family. And as I'm sure it was for Biden, and I'm sure he cringes every time something comes out about his son's behavior as a drug addict. Let's put that aside, because clearly empathy and compassion are not any of these people's strong points. My understanding, and I want to be clear, I'm not pretending to have any inside information, is that there's a pending tax investigation. There's also some pending investigation regarding a possible unlawful possession of a weapon by Biden. But those are the two things criminally that are being handled out of the FBI Baltimore field office, because that laptop, you'll remember, came out of Delaware, a shop in Delaware. Delaware happens to be covered by the FBI Maryland. So there you have that. There's a U.S. attorney, talk about Merrick Garland being smart and fair. He kept a Republican U.S. attorney on in Maryland to continue to handle the Hunter Biden case. He didn't appoint. Every other U.S. attorney, for the most part, was replaced. He kept this guy on knowing all eyes would be on this case. So pending taxes, pending gun possession. The big issue for me, and I wrote a column about this about a year ago, I'm a counterintel guy, right? When I hear strong evidence that known Chinese intelligence officers and co-optees were in touch with Hunter Biden, trying to gain influence. And by the way, I can sit here and rattle off every other Chinese government attempt through history to get close to George Bush's brother, Neil, and it's all public information, right? They do it. If you've got the last name of a president, you're going to get visited by Chinese intelligence officers and lots of money will be dangled in front of you. That needs to be investigated. I'm confident it's being investigated, but I'm also hearing, this is where I'm going to put my media hat on and sources. I'm hearing that they can't find the direct line to Joe Biden. That, I know people are going to on the left, on the right, are going to be sorely disappointed to hear this. But
as they say, too bad, right?
I've yet to hear anybody go, we've got the money flowing to Biden.
By the way, if in fact that they had that, I promise you, it would be out there right now, front and center. It would have been out there from day number one. No doubt in my mind.
Right. Now, why is it taking so long for a tax case against Biden or a gun case? Simple case, right? I can't answer that question. I don't know what the holdup is on that. And it's possible, this is conjecture, that the counterintel case is still going. Like, my God, we had a lot of Chinese intelligence people running around this guy. Mm-hmm. And maybe they need to sort that out. I don't know, but my understanding is the case has not been closed.
Yeah. Well, Frank, as always, great to get your perspective. Great to see you. Happy holidays, my friend. Enjoy. And as this shit continues to progress and more questions come up, I'm gonna ask you right back here on to Mea Culpa.
Always a good discussion. Stay safe, my friend.
You too. Be well, my friend.
I'm Ben Meiselas, filling in for Michael Popak, and this is Legal AF with Karen Friedman Agnifilo. Karen, I'm so excited to be hosting this with you. We've got a lot of topics